On April 2, 2025, Donald Trump stood before a crowd in Ohio and made an announcement that immediately echoed around the world. The event wasn't just a regular speech. It was part of his public push as he returned to political center stage, this time not as a candidate, but as a once-again president. Having secured a historic second, non-consecutive term in the 2024 election, Trump was now entering what would be his final 4 years in office. And he wasn't wasting any time. He called the day Liberation Day. In typical Trump fashion, it was bold, dramatic, and designed to get attention. But behind the branding was a serious and sweeping economic move. He announced that starting April 5th, every imported product coming into the United States would face a new 10% tariff. No country was spared. Whether it was China, Germany, Vietnam, or even longtime allies like Japan or Canada, if it was foreign-made, it was going to cost more. But the plan didn't stop there. Some countries got hit even harder. China, a longtime target of Trump's trade criticism, was slammed with a total of 54% in tariffs after years of ongoing trade tensions. Vietnam faced a 46% tariff. Even the European Union was slapped with a 20% rate. The justification was simple in Trump's eyes. These countries had been running large trade surpluses with the United States, and he believed they were taking advantage of American workers and businesses. This wasn't a new philosophy for Trump. He had used tariffs during his first term from 2017 to 2021, often referring to them as a way to rebalance what he saw as broken trade deals. But now, in his final term, with no re-election to worry about, Trump was going even further. He had nothing to lose, and that made him more aggressive than ever. Some key imports were exempted, like crude oil, certain medicines, and semiconductors. But the core message remained. It's time to make things in America again, or pay the price. The impact was immediate. Stock markets dipped. Businesses scrambled to understand what this meant for their supply chains. Economists warned of higher prices for American families. Other nations began preparing their own tariffs in response, particularly China, which promised to retaliate without hesitation. But Trump seemed unfazed. In fact, he appeared energized. For him, this wasn't just about economics. It was about control, pride, and restoring what he called true American independence. He wasn't just reshaping trade. He was redefining the global economic order, one tariff at a time. Whether this bold strategy will strengthen American industry or ignite a prolonged economic conflict is yet to be seen. But one thing is clear. Trump is back, and he's playing by his own rules. Just a week after the world absorbed the shock of Trump's sweeping 10% tariff on all imported goods, he did it again. Only this time, it wasn't just bold, it was nuclear. On April 9, 2025, from the White House briefing room packed with journalists and flashing cameras, President Donald J. Trump stepped forward and delivered a message that would escalate the global trade war to levels never seen before in modern history. He announced that, effective immediately, the United States was imposing a 125% tariff on all Chinese imports, which now further increased to 145% tariff. Not 15%, not 50%, a stunning, all-out 145%. It wasn't just a tax anymore, it was a declaration, and it wasn't hard to tell who it was aimed at. Behind him stood a new backdrop. America will not be bullied. And he opened with words that were both blunt and fiery. China thinks they can take advantage of us again. They were wrong in 2019, and they're wrong now. We will not tolerate cheating, theft, or blackmail. Not under my watch. The room fell into a stunned silence. Just hours before Trump's announcement, China had imposed 84% retaliatory tariffs on a wide array of U.S. goods, from agricultural exports to automobiles and electronics. It was Beijing's response to Trump's earlier April 2nd move, his across-the-board 10% tariff on all imports. Trump wasn't just reacting, he was retaliating harder, and publicly. He accused China of intellectual property theft, of currency manipulation, and of flooding the U.S. market with underpriced goods. He claimed that the Chinese Communist Party had weaponized trade, and that the U.S. had been playing defense for too long. Now it was a fence. But in the same breath as he announced the crushing tariff on China, Trump surprised the world with another unexpected move. one that seemed, at first glance, oddly restrained. He declared that tariffs on more than 90 other countries would be paused for 90 days. That meant, for a limited time, countries not involved in direct retaliation against the US would only face the original 10% baseline tariff, and not the higher punitive rates many had feared. It was a calculated carrot-and-stick strategy. To China, economic war. To others, a chance to come to the table. Trump's advisors described this move as smart pressure. The idea was to isolate China, force a wedge between it and other nations, and encourage those countries to renegotiate trade deals under new American terms. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called it a time-limited window for allies and partners to prove they're serious about fair trade. For the moment, global markets breathed a sigh of relief. Stocks rebounded slightly. Countries like Germany, Japan, South Korea, and India began quietly reaching out to Washington, signaling openness to talks. But beneath the surface, the anxiety hadn't gone anywhere. Everyone knew the 90-day pause was a ticking clock, and everyone was watching the showdown between the world's two largest economies, the US and China, spiral deeper into confrontation. Beijing responded swiftly and angrily. State broadcasters ran back-to-back coverage accusing the US of economic blackmail. A statement from China's Ministry of Commerce described the 125% tariff as a reckless violation of international norms and vowed that China would fight to the end. Behind closed doors, Chinese officials were more than angry. They were alarmed. The 125% tariff effectively priced many Chinese products out of the American market. That meant massive potential losses for Chinese manufacturers, especially in electronics, textiles, machinery, and consumer goods. For years, China had relied on exports to the US to fuel its economic engine. Now, a huge chunk of that engine was under siege. And yet, in Beijing, the decision was made. No backing down. Instead, China doubled its retaliatory tariffs on American goods, encouraged domestic consumers to boycott US brands, and even hinted at restricting access to rare earth minerals vital to American tech and defense industries. The trade war had entered a dangerous new phase. At home, the response was deeply divided. Supporters of Trump, especially in industrial and manufacturing states, cheered the move. They believed this was long overdue. They blamed China for years of lost jobs and closed factories. For them, this was justice. In Michigan, an auto worker interviewed by a local station put it simply, "It's about time someone stood up to China. We've been getting screwed for decades." But business leaders, economists, and trade experts warned of chaos ahead. They pointed to rising prices, disrupted supply chains, and the real risk of global economic slowdown. Major retailers like Walmart and Best Buy voiced concerns that many products on their shelves, phones, TVs, clothes, tools, would see immediate price hikes. Small businesses feared not just higher costs, but broken supplier relationships built over years. And farmers, still scarred from the previous trade war, braced for new pain. China's retaliatory tariffs again targeted U.S. agriculture, soybeans, pork, corn, and wheat, cutting off access to a market they had fought hard to regain. For Donald Trump, though, this was more than just policy. It was personal. He saw the global economic system as rigged against America. And in his second term, with no re-election ahead, he was determined to burn down the old playbook and rewrite the rules. Trump had always believed that trade was a battlefield, and now the war was fully underway. The question wasn't just whether the US could win. The question was, what would be left of the global economy by the time it was over? Behind the scenes of Trump's dramatic tariff announcements, something else has been quietly shifting: the bond market. When countries trade goods, they also move money, and the US government borrows a lot of it, mainly through treasury bonds. Investors buy these bonds, and in return, the US pays them interest, known as the bond yield. Now, here's where it gets interesting. A high bond yield means the US has to pay more to borrow money. That's bad for the economy, especially when the government is already running large deficits and spending billions. A low yield means cheaper borrowing and more financial flexibility. So if you're a president trying to fuel domestic growth, you want those yields to stay low. And guess who buys a massive amount of US debt? China. When Trump hits China with huge tariffs, he's not just disrupting trade. He's shaking up financial flows too. If he can reduce the US trade deficit, That also means you fewer dollars flowing out of the country. That could, in theory, lead to lower bond yields over time, making it cheaper for the US to borrow. But here's the twist. China can also fight back by selling US bonds or stopping new purchases. That would normally cause yields to spike, but Trump may be betting that other nations, especially those exempt from the harsh tariffs for 90 days, will jump in and buy those bonds instead, keeping rates stable. In simpler terms, Trump's tariff war might be a long-term play to shift who holds US debt, bring down borrowing costs, and boost American spending power. Of course, this is risky. If it backfires, interest rates could rise, inflation could grow, and the economy could slow. But in Trump's view, it's worth the gamble, especially in a second and final term where he's aiming to reshape America's financial and trade foundations permanently. So yes, tariffs aren't just about goods anymore. They're about money, power, and the cost of running America. And the bond yield is quietly at the heart of it all. At first, it was just a tariff. Then it became a headline. But within weeks, it became something much bigger, a chain reaction. The 2025 tariff war, once framed as an economic tool, was now tearing through the veins of global trade. And it wasn't just China or the United States feeling the heat. It was everyone. From the ports of Hamburg to the warehouses of Ho Chi Minh City, from factories in Mexico to microchip plants in Taiwan, the world's supply chains, once perfectly tuned to decades of free trade, began to snap under the weight of Trump's new policies. It started in electronics. U.S. importers relying on Chinese-made components were suddenly slapped with up to 125% in new costs. Laptops, smartphones, routers, semiconductors, everything got more expensive or worse, unavailable. Then came autos. Major American car manufacturers had spent years designing supply chains that spanned the globe. Engines from Japan, chips from Korea, parts from Mexico, steel from China. But with tariffs hitting nearly every corner of that chain, delays turned into stoppages. A single Chinese circuit board taxed at 125% could now halt production on a $40,000 SUV in Tennessee. CEOs began sounding the alarm. Inventory began shrinking. Warehouses sat half-stocked. And consumers? They started to notice too. Prices ticked up. Delays grew longer. Suddenly, things that used to take 2 days to arrive were taking 2 weeks or more. This wasn't just economic pressure anymore, it was a global stress test. Trump's tariffs had weaponized uncertainty, and uncertainty is poison in a supply chain. No factory can operate smoothly if the rules change every week. No logistics manager can plan shipping routes if tomorrow's taxes might double. And so companies began to shift. Some US businesses started pulling out of China altogether, looking to Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and even reshoring operations back to America. But moving a supply chain isn't like flipping a switch. It's like rerouting a river. It takes time, it's expensive, and mistakes are easy. In Vietnam, labor costs surged. In India, infrastructure bottlenecks choked exports. In Mexico, rising US tariffs wiped out early optimism. Everyone wanted a piece of the China alternative boom, but few were ready. The result? A global scramble. And a lot of broken systems. But while businesses struggled to adapt, governments were having their own reckoning. The world was waking up to a truth many had ignored for decades. The US wasn't just a trading partner. It was the center of the global trade system. And now, it was using that position like a sledgehammer. Trump wasn't just slapping on tariffs. He was redrawing the economic world map. Countries that had once relied on stable trade deals with the US suddenly found themselves on edge, unsure if they were next in line for a 50% hike or a full exemption. The message was clear. If you want access to the American market, you play by Trump's rules. This forced world leaders into hard choices. Some countries, like Japan, the UK, and Australia, began aligning more closely with Washington, hoping to secure deals and avoid punishment. Others, like Brazil, Russia, and Iran, saw opportunity in China's corner, joining informal alliances to resist US pressure. In the middle were dozens of nations, caught between the two giants, unsure which direction to move. And so, a new kind of Cold War began to take shape. Not one defined by missiles and ideology, but by supply chains and shipping routes. The question was no longer, whose side are you on? But, whose goods are you buying? Whose chips are in your phone? Whose ports do your containers land in? America was trying to reclaim control. China was trying to defend its dominance. And the rest of the world? Trying to survive in the crossfire. The global economy had been built on the promise of efficiency, of the cheapest, fastest, most seamless path from factory to front door. But in Trump's world, efficiency was no longer the goal. Leverage was. Who you depend on became a vulnerability. And that meant nations had to rethink everything, from trade policy to national security, from alliances to supply routes. In Brussels, officials began quietly fast-tracking deals with India and Southeast Asia, looking to hedge against U.S. unpredictability. In Beijing, China doubled down on its Belt and Road Initiative, accelerating infrastructure projects across Africa and the Middle East to open new trade corridors free from Western interference. And in Washington, Trump's team watched the world shift, just as planned. Because for all the chaos, all the broken links and rising prices, one thing was happening that hadn't happened in decades. The world was listening to America again, and that, to Trump, was victory. By mid-2025, it was no longer just a tariff war. It was a reckoning. What began with a 10% tax on imported goods had spiraled into a global conflict of money, influence, and ideology. Trump's tariffs on China had soared to 125%. Entire industries were feeling the squeeze. Countries once considered allies were now holding emergency meetings to discuss trade realignments. And across the world, economists began to ask, what happens next? In the US, the impact was creeping into everyday life. Groceries were more expensive. Electronics were harder to find. Small businesses struggled to keep shelves stocked. Retailers had quietly started cutting back on product lines. People were noticing the difference, not in charts or indexes, but in receipts and routines. And the political divide was sharpening. In blue-collar towns, Trump's supporters stood firm. They called the pain short-term, the policy necessary. They believed this was what real leadership looked like. Putting the country first, even if it hurt in the moment. But in cities, financial centers, and among independent voters, the mood was different. They saw the tariffs not as strength, but as economic sabotage. They feared long-term damage to America's financial standing and global reputation. Meanwhile, the global economy was shifting under the surface. Countries that had relied on trade with the US began hedging their bets. Some turned to China for deals, funding, and new supply chains. Others embraced regional blocs and free trade zones that didn't involve Washington at all. And slowly, the foundations of the old global order began to crack. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, once untouchable, was now being questioned in backrooms and boardrooms. For the first time in decades, central banks around the world started increasing their reserves in gold, the euro, and the yuan, just in case. A quiet but powerful idea had taken hold. If the US could weaponize trade once, it could do it again. And that made it a risk. In response, a new axis of cooperation began to emerge. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, intensified talks to launch a new currency to challenge the dollar. China offered favorable loans and trade deals to countries hurt by US tariffs, subtly drawing them into its sphere of influence. Even traditional US allies like France and Germany began floating the idea of a more autonomous European financial system, one that could protect them from the swings of American politics. All of this raised a deeper question, not just about trade, but about the kind of world we were heading into. For decades, the global economy had moved toward integration. Borders meant less. Markets meant more. But now, in 2025, that momentum had reversed. We were entering a new era, one of fragmented globalization, where trust was fragile, alliances were conditional, and trade was no longer neutral. In this new world, trade was power, and whoever controlled it, controlled everything. And in the center of it all stood Donald J. Trump. He hadn't backed down. He hadn't compromised. And he had forced the world to respond. To his supporters, he had made good on his promise. Put America first. To his critics, he had jeopardized decades of global stability for the sake of ego and ideology. But no one, not friend, not foe, could deny that he had changed the game. The 2025 tariff war wasn't just about imports and exports. It was about the shape of the next century. Would America lead by force or by example? Would nations turn inward or find a new way to cooperate? Would the global economy bend or break? The answers are still unfolding. But one thing is certain. Donald Trump's second term didn't just revive a trade war. It rewrote the rules of the global economy. And we are all still living in the aftermath.